Okay, fantastic. All right, perfect. Yeah, I had an audio setting set, so let me start again. Hello, my name is Mike Egg, and this is one of our Unity sessions. This is the first time we are integrating Twitch into our own page, so that you can view and chat all from the same location on our Unity page. Now, obviously, we had some issues to start, but now we are ready to begin and ready to start this thing. I might take some pauses here while I'm talking, only because now I'm monitoring two chat windows, because we have a lot of people on Twitch TV and we have a lot of people on our own page. So obviously in the future we're going to have to figure out this whole chat situation. So if I go quiet for a second, I'm probably reading and trying to figure out who's saying what and what's going on. So yeah. Okay, real quick before we start, I do want to show you guys this screen, so feel free to contact us, follow us on Twitter, at Unity3D, at Mike Geig, which is me, at Will Goldstone, and at The Ant Ranch. Feel free to pass along any questions, any comments that you have, any suggestions, anything like that. Be more than happy to listen to those and do whatever we can do to, make this a better, more effective experience for all of you, learning experience for all of you. So, great. Okay. So today, I wanted to talk today about this concept of terrain, okay? And so, you might be familiar with the concept of terrain, you may not. I don't know if you've worked with Unity or any other engine in the past, you may or may not be familiar with it. But basically, terrain is any form of an outside environment, okay? Anything non-man-made. So we're talking valleys or plains or hills or mountains or deserts or whatever. So if you're basically working with a game that has any place outside or with the ground or with dirt or anything like that, you will be working with terrain, all right? You'll be working with basically the basics of terrain and terrain sculpting, okay? So creating terrain in Unity is actually kind of a little bit different than working with terrain or working with any other type of game object in Unity. We can work with models and meshes and sound clips and animations and all that stuff, but terrain is kind of this very special thing. So that's why we've dedicated just an entire session specifically to talking about that. So there are two ways that we can actually sculpt or mold our terrain, and those two ways are using a height map and actually physically sculpting that terrain, and we're going to talk about both of those this session. But before we get into that, let's talk about how we actually add terrain to our scene. So what I have here in Unity is just basically an empty project. I just have my camera and that's it. And what I want to do is I want to add some terrain. Now, if you're using a previous version of Unity, you might have a terrain menu here at the top. I'm using Unity 4.21 or something like that, so I no longer have the terrain menu at the top. The terrain menu is a little bit different. So for me to add terrain, so if you have the terrain menu, you're going to want to click Terrain, Create Terrain. Okay? If you don't have the terrain menu, if you're using a newer version of Unity, you're going to click Game Object, Create Other, and you're going to come here to Terrain. Okay, so this is the new location of the terrain creation. So I'm just going to go ahead and click that. And what I get is I get this giant piece of terrain. It's actually quite massive, much larger than what we specifically need to start. And I'm going to talk really quick about these items here in the inspector. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because we're going to come back and we're going to address them each individually when the time comes. So we have our raise lower terrain tool options. We have our paint height tool options, our smooth height tool, our paint texture tool options, place trees, paint details like grass and stuff like that, and then our terrain settings. So we are going to spend a little bit of time here in terrain settings, and then we're going to start looking at forming our terrain and the physical elements of this terrain. So real quick here, if you're following along, great. If you're not a big deal. But with the terrain settings selected, I'm going to pay attention to a very specific or a very special section called resolution. And the resolution determines how big my terrain is. Right now it's 2000 by 2000, which is really big. All right, it's huge. It's much larger than what we need. So I'm going to go ahead and just set this down to 200. All right, much more manageable section of terrain. All right, so I have this terrain now. It's still quite big. This is still a very large piece of terrain. However, this should be more than sufficient for right now. Okay, I don't really want to get too much smaller because I want to show you some different things. The height, I'm going to leave at 600. Now, leaving the height at 600 is not a good idea. I'm doing it anyway. And I'm going to show you why it's not necessarily a good idea, and I'm going to show you the effect of leaving the height so very large can possibly have. We also have a height map resolution of 513, which is going to become important when we start dealing with height maps, which actually is right now. And actually, before I talk about that, I do want to show you that there is one more special item on here. So our terrain is a game object, has its transform, and has this terrain script attached to it. But it also has a terrain collider, which is a special type of collider, which is basically useful for when we want to move around in the terrain and stuff like that. So the terrain collider is a very special thing that's part of terrain specifically. Okay. So let us talk about height maps. All right, and we're going to talk about these resolutions and what height maps effectively mean. So before I get into actually using height maps, I kind of want to talk about what a height map is. Okay, height maps are not new to Unity. They're something that have been used for some time now. They're used in other engines and stuff like that. They're just, basically a common practice when dealing with terrain. So basically, since our terrain is square, we can build a map of colors that will basically translate to different altitudes on our terrain, right? Otherwise known as a height map. So a height map effectively is a black and white image, okay? A black and white image that correlates to some height, all right? So let me show you an example of a height map, all right? So this here, what you're seeing on the screen, it's small and it's faint, and that's fine. You'll see exactly what happens with this here in a second. It's small and it's faint. You can probably barely see it. All right, but that is a height map. Okay, the black areas correspond to the lowest possible altitude, and the lighter areas correspond to higher altitude. And the way this works is this is based on 8-bit or 256 shades of gray. So if you're seeing just black, there should be a little bit of white in there, but maybe it's just too dark as I'm sending it across the internet. Trust me, there is some stuff there, though it is fairly faint, and it's a very subtle effect. So basically, we have this range of colors between 0 and 256, or between 0 and 255 for 256 shades of gray. All right, and the way it works is we take whatever color is at a specific pixel, whatever quantity of black is at a specific pixel, and we apply a simple mathematical formula to it, and we determine how high that piece of terrain is. So, for instance, I have this little cheat sheet here. Let me find it. Here we go. So basically, let's pretend our max height is 60. Okay. If our max height is 60 and one pixel on our height map is black, all right, black is 0 in the color scheme of things. Right? Yeah, right. As was said in chat, it's like a monochromatic heat map. Absolutely. 0 divided by 255 is 0 times 60. We know the height of that pixel will be 0. If that particular pixel is white, which is 255, 255 divided by 255 times 60 is 60. If it's a light gray color, let's say 153, all right, 153 divided by 255 is 0.6 times 60 gives us 36, all right? So we can mathematically determine these heights based on the color and stuff like that, but basically, oh, I'm sorry. So someone was chatting to me. So basically, we can use the volumes and stuff like that, or the heights to determine, or I'm sorry, the colors that determine the different heights and things like that. Okay, just had to close the chat window here. Apologize. So for the height maps I'll be using today, so we had a question here, Dennis. The height map I will be using here today will be 8-bit, not 16-bit, which is why we have the 0 to 255. 16-bit, we'd have more color ranges. All right, fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to turn my little cheat sheet off here, and we'll actually see this in action. So again, this is the height map I'll be using. It's dark, but I'll show you here in a second the effect it's going to have. So what I want to do is I want to import this height map. So I want to take the black and white information from this height map, and I want to actually modify my terrain based on this. Now in Unity specific, Height maps have to be a raw format. That's .raw, raw, okay? Can't see any of those settings. So if you are using an older version of Unity, all of this stuff, the resolution stuff, will be under a terrain menu near the top. So you'll have to click terrain, and then there's a set resolution button, all right, or option. If you don't have this stuff here in the inspector, it'll be in the terrain menu at the top. So I see some people saying that they don't have that terrain menu, or the terrain settings here. They're up there. So basically, yeah, there's a terrain menu at the top, and that's where all this stuff is going to be. So RAWs, again, in Unity are a .raw format, and they can be 8-bit or 16-bit, and they can use Mac or Windows encoding. I generally just leave them as Mac encoding, 8-bit, and that always seems to be good enough for me. The height map also needs to be the same size as the height map resolution that we see here in the inspector view. The height map resolution will allow the height map files that you bring in to match correctly. All right. So let's go ahead and see this work. So what I have here is I've got this folder that I will bring. Of course, it's misbehaving now that I'm doing this. Okay, so my Internet Explorer window is misbehaving now. There we go. Okay, so I have this folder I created called Twitch Assets, and I have all these things in there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this sample.raw. So this is the JPEG I was showing you. This is the sample raw.raw, and I'm just going to take this and I'm going to drop it into Unity. I don't have to do that, but it's going to make finding it easier. All right. So a question here is, are we going to end up with some kind of project by the end of this presentation? No, we're not going to end up doing a project, only because since we just started doing this, I don't have a real way to share files with you yet, though that is something that we'll consider in the future. That's always something that we can try to do, but for now, we're just keeping this more of a presentation stuff. All right. Okay, so let's see here. So I moved this sample raw in here. I didn't have to do that, but I chose to do that so it'll make the file easier to find. Okay, so with my terrain selected, I'm going to come down here to import raw, and I'm going to go into my assets, and I'm going to find the sample raw. Now I'm going to get all of these. Of course, it's going to happen. So apparently the software I use, when I drag the window over, it goes nuts just due to the recording software. So let's try this again. I'm just going to explain to you what I'm seeing, because otherwise you're going to see that happened last time as well. But basically, the menu I'm given asks me what my depth is, my width, and my height. I'm basically not changing any of those options. So if you're following along, you don't need to change any of those options. If you made your height map correctly, as in the same dimensions as your height map resolution, all you have to do is click import. All the rest of the stuff doesn't matter. And so I'm going to click import, and my screen's going to go kind of crazy. All right, and we can see this here. It goes a little wacky, a little blocky. It's just strange looking. Okay, and the reason is because of my terrain height. All right, it's much bigger than it needs to be, and it has come in kind of strange. All right, and it's because we have this maximum height of 600. So I'm going to change this down to 60, and I hope this works. I just made this today, so hopefully this works just fine. Okay, and so what we get is we get something a little bit more strange. That didn't work right. Let's see here. Let me delete this. Of course, today would be a day where things go weird. I'm going to go ahead and flatten this. I'll talk about what the flattening does and everything here in a second. But let me double check my stuff here. Let me import this again. This time I'm going to pull it just from the file or folder that I had it in. Well, this is the fun part about live presenting, isn't it? The stuff that worked right before you guys got on is the stuff that doesn't work now that there's all these people here. Oh man, that's fun. Okay, so what I'm going to do real quick here too is I'm going to add a directional light just to add a little bit of contrast. But my height map importing did not work. It's actually behaving kind of strange. And actually, so the people in the chat is saying that 8-bit always leaves this banding. I just built this a little bit ago. 8-bit works fine. I don't know what happened, but now it's not seeming to want to behave for me. So, of course, that's what happens when you present live. Let's try this again. I'll switch it over to 16. Maybe I did make it 16 and just sort of forgot. Nope, it's not 16. It is definitely 8-bit. Oh well, yep, it's not working appropriately. Not really a big deal, because we will just go ahead and sculpt ourselves. That's fine. Very strange how that is working, but whatever, what are you going to do? Now I do want to show you another kind of height map here, just to sort of to strike home the difference between the two. And I'm going to go ahead and change my resolution down to 100. Make it a little bit small, a little bit easier to work with. And what I want to do is I want to show you this height map. So again, this is a height map. This is actually a raw black and white. Yeah, I see that array index is out of range, which is peculiar because I didn't even close this window. This is the exact same, everything that I was using right before this started. So I don't want to make excuses. I did something wrong. We're live. I don't want to mess around with it. Whatever. So I have a height map here, which says Unity Rocks, all black and white. So effectively what we're going to have is we're going to have the black portion be all completely low, and the white portion where it says Unity Rocks is all going to be elevated. All right, and we are going to go ahead and see how this works. And so, of course, I'm going to cross my fingers here and hope this works appropriately, because this is another one I just built and tested. We'll see if it works. But I have this Unity Rocks raw, and I'll hit open. I'll import it, and there we go. This one's behaving appropriately. Here we have this giant Unity rock sticking out here. Okay, and we can obviously lower this by lowering the height of our height map a bit, and we can see. So this file works fine. I must have done something to the other file. I'm not entirely certain. Maybe I corrupted it while I was messing around. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on it. But we can see that this one works. It is backwards, just how it, based on how it loads. The image, I wanted to have Unity Rocks written correctly in the version that I showed you, and not backwards in the version I showed you, so that it was correct here. But I could always just invert the raw, and I would see it correctly here. All right, so we see Unity Rocks written in the terrain right here. So that was my little endeavor into height maps. Yeah, I need to fix something there. But I'm going to go ahead and just wipe this out now, because this did not work all the way I wanted. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new terrain. Some days are like that. It's how you know it's Monday, right? So, alright. So I've created a new terrain, and I'm going to go ahead and remove my old terrain. Terrains get turned into assets here. I'm just going to remove both of those. And in the console, I'm going to clear. There we go. So that error goes away. Now that I've cleared out all that and got rid of the error, I will create my terrain again. There we go. Alright. Now again, I'm going to go ahead and reduce this size. We'll go 200 and 200, and we'll go ahead and change the maximum height here to be something like, I don't know, we'll say 50. 50 is a good height. Okay. So the terrain that we create is basically flat and at 0 to start. And what that means is that I can't dig into it at all. The terrain starts as low as it can possibly get, the lowest point it can possibly get. And we need to actually raise it up, make it higher to actually have any effect. Okay? You know, and I'll show you other ways that we can raise the terrain to dig in much easier, but first off, I'll just show you some of the basics of sculpting. So what we want to do now is we were going to actually modify by hand this terrain, and we are going to build it so, you know, build it so that we can have different unique experiences in our game. So I'll start with this button up here in the upper left hand corner, all right, of our terrain script. This is the Raise Lower Terrain tool, okay? By clicking on this, I get this kind of blue circle over my terrain. And what this is a brush, okay? And this brush effectively allows me to paint. All we're really doing is painting our own height map behind the scenes. The reason I showed you height maps is so you can kind of understand what's happening behind the camera, right? We are basically using a brush and we are painting the color white onto a black image, and that is increasing our terrain. A question was asked what size. The terrain right now is 200 by 200 with a maximum height of 50, and our brush size and stuff like that are right here. So I can effectively just click and drag, and you can see that my terrain will start to rise. It's a subtle effect. It's even made more subtle by the fact that the terrain is completely white and the way the camera is situated, or the directional light is situated. But if I were to come over this way, you would see more of how I can paint here. And I can just raise up terrain. Just by clicking and holding and moving my mouse around, I effectively raise the terrain. Alright, this is the basis of painting or sculpting our terrain. Alright, it's a slow working effect, okay? Like this. Yeah. So this allows us to move this stuff around and paint. Now let's talk a little bit about these brushes now that you know what the brushes does, right? The brush basically allows me to paint color on the height map behind. Unity has a lot of built-in brushes. So I could pick something like a hard circle line, right, as you can see right there. Or the one that I prefer has more of kind of a fuzziness to it to kind of make smoother painting. If you like stars, you can make a star brush, so on and so forth. You can actually even make your own brushes, all right, and bring that in to Unity, right? So if you have some specific brush textures or whatever that you particularly like to use, you can bring those in and make use of those, all right? We have a couple options here. We have a slider for the brush size, which allows me to choose the maximum size of my brush, or I can make it real tiny, right, to give me a good level of control there. And then we have this opacity, and the opacity allows me to tell how strong the effect is. So with an opacity of 20, if I click here, you can kind of see the effect that I have, right? Just this little bit right there. However, if I set my opacity much higher, when I click, you can see the effect is much stronger, all right? So we can use our opacity to really make more quick work of our sculpting. So the same brush that I had previously with a much higher opacity allows me to raise my terrain much faster, all right? And all I'm doing is just clicking and holding and moving my mouse back and forth, and I can make mountains and whatever, ridges and all sorts of stuff, and slowly begin to sculpt some terrain that I like. Now it's kind of bland for now, and it will be bland until we get some texture on there, but you can see how we can effectively just kind of move the mouse around. Now that's all well and good, but what if I create something over here and all of a sudden I'm not particularly happy with it? That doesn't exactly look like a very realistic mountain, right? That's a real issue. Well, we can do the exact opposite of painting the white on the height map. We can paint black onto the height map to lower the sections. And we do that by just holding the shift button and clicking. Holding shift while we click and hold reduces. All right, so clicking raises, shift clicking reduces. All right, you will see that I can't go down any further. Absolute 0 is as low as it goes. I can't reduce my terrain. So if I wanted to cut a valley, I'd first have to raise everything up, all right, just like this, raise everything up to then cut a valley in between, right? And so that may not be like super useful just yet, but that's what this particular tool does, all right? This particular tool allows you to raise and lower to a specific amount. Now, let's say I wanted to more easily cut a valley in, okay? Or let's say I just wanted to erase this. Like I got, you know, through the process of sculpting and this just wasn't really working, wasn't really looking like how I wanted it to look, okay? I can always flatten my terrain. And flattening my terrain allows me just to reset it back to a completely flat state. So the very next tool here is the flat or the paint height tool, okay? So I have the raise lower tool, right next to it the paint height tool. Now, if you are using an older version of Unity and you want to flatten your terrain, there's a terrain menu option at the top that you'll click that, and I believe from there you just click flatten terrain. You might have to go into set resolution and click, I don't quite remember. There's an option in that menu somewhere to flatten your terrain, and I think it's under your set resolution, but I'm not entirely certain. But if you have a newer version of Unity, that is here underneath the paint height tool. You will see this height in this button that says flatten with the number 0 beside it. So if I hit flatten, my roll gets flat again. All right, basically sets everything back equal to 0. Everything is flat again. Now, that still doesn't enable me to cut valleys. I'm holding down shift, and I still can't cut valleys or anything like that. All right. Instead, what I might want to do is, oh, someone told me here in the chat that you do go to terrain, flatten height map. So thank you very much. Appreciate that. So what I want to do is I actually want to take my height, and I'm going to say 20, and then I'm going to hit flatten. The world stays flat, but did you see that it popped up a little bit? It's actually higher than 0 now, which is useful to me because now I can hold shift and I can cut into the ground. All right, the ground is actually at 20, not at 0, which enables me to cut into it without raising it, right? Which is super useful if I want to start with, you know, a valley, right? One thing to be aware of, though, that I can still only go down to 0. So if I keep lowering and keep lowering, eventually I hit 0. And you can see that's what I've done here. When it starts to flatten out like that, I'm now at 0. I can't go in any further. So if I needed it to be even deeper, I would need to raise my terrain even higher, right? Does that make sense? So I can only go down so far. Okay? And again, if I come over here to this tool, I can hit flatten again and erase that stuff. All right. Now, that being said, let's look at this other tool. Let's look at the paint height tool, which is right here. Now, the paint height tool works just like the raise lower tool, just like this tool. The difference is I can specify a maximum height to allow myself to paint, or maximum depth I can allow myself to cut in, right? So I basically can set myself. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to pick the hard round brush, and I'm going to set my height to 25, and I'm going to paint. There we go. Now, I can't go higher than 25. It will not let me, okay? So cap set at 25. So then I'm going to say 30, and I'm going to come over here and do that, and then I'm going to say 35, and maybe come over here. And what that kind of enables me to do is build sort of like a natural steppy style terrain piece. All right, say 40, kind of do one of these. Right, so now you can see like some natural step formation in here. If I was playing like a game and the player wanted to jump here and then here and then here and then here or whatever, right? So that enables me to step by step change stuff. If I wanted to set this to say 15 and click, then all of a sudden I don't have to shift click. I just can click, and you see that it'll lower my terrain. And then let's say 10, and I click. It's just gonna paint whatever height I tell it. Right? And so now you can see it's gone into the ground. Okay? So the paint height tool allows me to cap myself. If I don't ever want to go above 25, right? Or let's say 35. 35, this allows me to paint just like the raise lower tool does without me ever having to worry about going above a specific mark. Because if I start to go up to that mark, you're going to see that it's going to cap out, and I'm not going to be able to go any higher than that. All right. So you can paint some nifty looking terrain and whatnot here. I'm going to go ahead and paint a few things here so that I can show you the next tool, which will require me to... Yeah, I'm actually going to go over my other tool so I can dig in a little bit. I'm just doing a bunch of weird, strange angles and stuff like that so that I can show you the next tool adequately. And... maybe that's enough stuff. We'll see. So what I'm looking for effectively is, now that I have raised and lowered my terrain and I have some strange, unique looking terrain piece. I don't know, this is kind of weird, but whatever. Let's say this is our terrain. Maybe we have a weird video game, alien planets or whatever, right? And we're trying to get over to the Pringle Mountains or something over there. But so we have this strange terrain piece. I want to kind of zoom in here and look around. What you will see as you get closer, that blue is going to get kind of annoying because I want to point without the blue. Let me just click my camera so you can see my mouse. You see these hard line ridges here? This is basically some rough sections caused by the tessellation in our terrain, all right? So we're getting these strange grooves, and it's just basically because we cut roughly into this terrain. We molded it, you know, and so some smoothing needs to happen, all right? So what we can do is we can use this third tool, which is right here, which is called smooth height. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the size down pretty considerably. I'm also going to bring the opacity down pretty considerably. And I'm going to use my faded round brush here. And I'm just going to go ahead and kind of smooth out those rough edges. See how much better that looks now? Much more natural. All right. There we go. Nice, smooth. There we go. So this is one of the part of sculpting terrain, is kind of removing a lot of those jagged edges. All right. And we use the smooth height tool to do that. You can see it warps the terrain a little bit. Right? But at the same time, it makes it much more pleasing to the eye, much more natural looking, much less jagged and rough around the edges. So at this point, I kind of want to take a second to explain that if you're someone who is actually making a terrain for a game, definitely don't expect your terrain to be even good at first, right? It takes a lot of time to build really good terrain. It's a skill I'm not particularly good at. I know how to do it, but I don't have an eye for it. I'm not very good at it. But it takes a lot of practice, and to build compelling terrain, to sculpt compelling terrain, it takes a lot of work, right? There's a lot of times you'll just be sitting here going smooth, 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 okay, smooth, 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 and it's kind of boring and it's kind of bland, but it's what you have to do to make your terrain look nice. So if you are someone who's building terrain, don't be discouraged if your terrain doesn't look amazing right away. Mine never looks amazing, so if you eventually get yours to look amazing, then you're already doing better than me. Another cool thing about the smooth height tool is you can use it to build in subtle erosion, which is always kind of fun. So if you have some rough edges and you kind of want to make the effects of time more apparent, you can use the smooth brush to kind of wear surfaces down and stuff like that. And yeah, make it look like it's been worn out a bit. I had a question here: would a smaller brush smooth the jaggy edges without affecting all the sides of the valley? I'm not sure what you're asking me. I don't know what you mean by affecting, but a smaller brush will just mean that the brush affects a smaller area. So if I reduce my brush size, then I'm obviously just affecting a much smaller area. Larger brush size, like I could do a huge brush here and just kind of go over all of the terrain at once, which is kind of my approach because I tend to be very lazy about these things. So I tend to just kind of hit everything all at once. But you'd be much better off by getting in there nitty gritty and doing the details thoroughly. You can also, as stated, you can reduce the opacity to make it a more subtle effect, or like I like to do is just pump the opacity up and just nuke my terrain. But that's me. Everyone's different. But you can achieve all sorts of different things with that tool. You can use it to do corrosion. You can use it to smooth out jagged edges and things like that. Now, the more work you put into your terrain now, the better look when you get to the stages where you're actually adding textures. All right, so you may think that you're just going to quickly breeze through this and then throw textures on it. It's going to look great. And that's not necessarily the case. All right, if you spend a lot of time now at this stage, when it comes time to put textures on things, things are going to look much more natural. So let's say you've built this terrain and you're pretty proud of this terrain, and you want to move this terrain to another project or whatever. You can certainly do that. You can certainly save the asset here, but there's something else that you can do which is actually quite neat. So I talked about this idea of height maps and how you take a height map and you can import it into your project. And then I talked about how when you are sculpting terrain, you are basically painting colors onto this height map, right? That's all you're really doing. Even when you smooth, you're just smoothing the color changes in the height map. And that's what you're doing. You're effectively changing this dark background, height map image. So what we have the ability to do is actually export that height map to save it for later. So if I come over here into terrain settings, all right, and I have this option to export raw. And if I click this, luckily the window opened in Unity, so it wasn't off screen, so you can actually see it. I have the option to choose my bit size and my byte order and things like that, and I have 513, and my byte order is Mac. I'm just going to leave that the way it is, and I'm just going to go ahead and click export, and I'll just leave it as terrain raw. There we go. And so that allows me to save my height map. All right, it allows me to export it out as a raw that I can bring it in again into another project or whatever. Okay. So we effectively have the ability to bring in height maps, sculpt our own terrain, export height maps, all that stuff, and all that stuff is fun. So let's see, what time is it? Let's talk a little bit about texturing real quick, all right? Texturing, and then we're going to see how to kind of run through our world. Now, texturing, again, is one of those things that you could spend a lot of time getting right, okay? And you can spend a lot of time getting your own textures and all these things and collecting them, but Unity has some standard available textures for you to use kind of as a placeholder. So if you're just getting started or whatever, you can feel free to use the built-in ones and always bring your old ones. As was mentioned in chat, if you're using the old Unity or an older version of Unity to export your height map, you go to the terrain menu and there's an export height map option. So thank you very much for providing that. What is your name? DXDIDAS. DXDIDAS or something. I don't know. But thank you. Yeah, you're going to go to the terrain menu and click export height map. Okay, so let's talk about some texturing. Currently, I don't have any assets in Unity, right, in my Unity project here. So I'm going to go ahead and add the terrain assets so that I have some of these textures to work with. So to add assets, I'm going to come up here to the assets menu, all right, and I'm going to come down to import package, and I'm going to look for terrain assets, okay, right here. And I'll click that, and I get a menu. Of course, it opened off screen. I'm not going to bother trying to drag it in because then it's just going to go wacky again because of the software that I'm using. But basically, there's a whole lot of terrain assets listed. They're all currently selected. All I'm going to do is click the import button. So if you're following along, just click import. That's all you really need to know. All the rest of the stuff is already picked, whatever. And then we get this nice folder here. So it says standard assets, and inside terrain assets. And inside terrain assets, we have grass and textures and trees and all that stuff. I don't really care about any of that stuff. I'm just going to leave it kind of condensed from there because that's not how we're going to go about using it. So once you have it there, perfect, okay? But we're actually going to access it a different way. So what I want to do is I want to look at this tool right here, which is my paint texture tool. And the paint texture tool allows me to, spoiler alert, paint textures, okay? So it's pretty neat. And first off, we're going to see a couple things. We're going to see our brushes again, all right? Because everything with terrain in Unity is basically painting or sculpting, right? So we deal a lot with brushes. But then we have, well, we still have our familiar settings, our brush size, our opacity, and our target strength. But what I'm looking at here is this texture section where it says no terrain textures defined. So what I need to do is I need to define textures, just like I would pour paint onto a color palette, right? I'd pour a little red and then a little yellow, and then I can dab my brush in red and paint red, and dab my brush in yellow and paint yellow, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Edit Textures, and I'm going to choose Add a Texture, all right? Obviously, that's what I want to do. We can't edit or remove any textures because none exist currently. So I'm going to click Add Texture. Oh, of course it popped up off screen. Ah, darn it. Darn it. Maybe if I bring it in here and then close it. Oh, hey, fantastic. So there we go. I learned how to fix it. I should have thought of that sooner. So what we get here is we get this window. And we can choose a texture and a normal map. I'm not working with any textures that have normal mapping, so I'm just going to ignore that part, and I'm going to work on just the texture itself. So I'm going to click Select, and I get this menu here of all these different textures that came in as part of the standard asset. I'm going to choose Grass Hill. I can actually just double-click that. I can also choose how big these are for their tiling and whatnot, but I'm just going to leave them at their default because that's fine. Now you're going to notice when I click Add, something crazy is going to happen. Boom! The whole world gets textured with the same texture. Since it's the first texture we picked, the whole world just gets that texture. Okay? So the first texture you pick should be your most common texture. You don't want to choose for your first texture something that's only used in a couple spaces, or else you're going to be doing a whole lot of erasing. Okay? So we have our world now is kind of textured. All right, it's kind of neat. All right, a little boring still. So let's look at what we can do to fix that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my paint texture, and I'm going to add another texture. So edit, add texture, and this time I'm going to pick, I like this, good dirt, as opposed to bad dirt. That's the good dirt. I'm going to choose grass and rock, though. And I'm going to hit add. So now I have this palette, and I can choose between my two textures. All right, and I'm going to choose my I believe, what was this, grass and hill or something like that, or rock and hill, I don't remember. This texture, I'm going to pick this texture. And my brush, I'm going to go ahead and reduce its size a little bit more, and its opacity maybe a little bit, pump up its strength. Let's see. And so now I'm going to do is I'm just going to paint, and you can see how that texture is starting to appear. I get a nice little mixture between the two. Now, you might be wondering, why is the texture so stretched here? And it's really stretched there because of how I built this piece of terrain. It's very few actual vertices of the terrain, but there's a huge height in between them. So I'd really want to work on that a little bit more to make it a little bit more realistic. I really want to increase the size of this particular piece of terrain to do that. But as you can see, I can just start painting here, and the more I paint, all right, the more that particular texture comes through. And I'm just going to apply it to the places where there's a large steep change, because grass wouldn't grow so much on these really steep sections. All right, we might get a little bit more rock face there. So you can see I'm just slowly painting. Again, just like with sculpting terrain, the painting of textures is something that takes a really long time. And you can definitely overdo it, and you want to avoid overdoing it, right? So it's one of those things that takes a lot of practice. And your terrain texturing will only be good as your terrain textures, right? If you have crummy textures, then your texturing is not going to be all that great, right? But it enables you to kind of practice a little bit and work through some sections and kind of break up the monotony. All right, so this section here, I'm going to a larger size, a larger opacity, kind of paint that much more quickly. So now you can already see how we're getting some variance, right? Say over there. Right, and I can make this as subtle of effect or as strong. It'll nicely interpolate between the two textures if I use a low opacity and a low strength. All right, it'll just have a little bit of the texture in there, and the more I paint over it, more of the texture comes through. All right, so I'm not going to sit here and paint this whole thing, just kind of show you what I'm talking about. Right, let's do one more texture, because only two is boring. I'm of the personal opinion that if you're not using 3 or more, then it's going to be kind of boring. So let's do one more here. So I'm going to edit a texture, add texture, select, and let's use my favorite good dirt, though cliff is fun. Cliff is good for like the really steep ridges, but I'm going to go ahead and do good dirt. And I'll hit add, and I'll select that, and again, let's do a larger brush. Okay, so with good dirt, we can kind of do one of these numbers, right? And have some roads or some paths or something like that. All right, some nice little pathing to kind of show the player where to travel. I don't know, something like that. Something you can do more subtle, you can do more obvious. Maybe with these step areas right here, I want to go much more strong. Let me reduce my, keep going over to the wrong tool. Reduce my brush size, increase my opacity and my strength. Maybe the tops of these are pretty much all dirt. You know, we could do something like this. Maybe some patches of grass in there. The key is to kind of just bounce the mouse around a little bit. Make it look all random and patchy. So we can achieve an effect, maybe something like that. It's a good dirt. Okay. Kind of patch it up a bit. Randomness is the key to natural looking things. If it's in order or it has sharp lines, it looks man-made. But if it's all weird and round and kind of chaotic, then it definitely looks more natural. It's fantastic. So, okay, so we have this terrain and this world and all that, and that's all well and good, and you can kind of look around and see it, but, you know, you don't really get a chance to explore it, right? You don't really get a chance to know if it's actually any good. I mean, looking at something in the scene view is very different from knowing whether or not something's actually good from a first-hand experience. So what I'm going to talk about, the last thing I want to talk about real quick today is I want to talk about the first-person controller. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining it or anything like that. I only want to talk about it so that we can have a chance to explore our world here. So what I want to do is I'm going to come up to Assets, Import Package, Character Controller. So I want to import the character controllers. You can build your own, but Unity has some built in. So since we're not doing anything specifically, you know, unique right? I don't really need to build my own character controller. So I'm just going to click this window here, and I'm actually going to try my trick again. Oh, wait a minute. Character controller, my window's going to go nuts, but I'm going to close it right here. Assets, import package, character controller. Great, I'm glad to see that consistently works. So again, I'm leaving all of these checked in, and I'm just going to hit import. All right. There we go. Okay. Okay, and so now on our standard assets, we have the character controller options right there. Fantastic. All right. So what I'm going to do is I have a third-person character controller here and a first-person. I don't really want to mess around with a third-person one, so I'm just going to take the first-person one, click it, and drag it into my scene. Now, of course, it starts kind of halfway embedded. We definitely don't want to run the scene right now, or it'll just fall right through the world. So what I want to do is I want to bring it up so it's above the terrain. And I'm also going to rotate it so it's facing not the edge. So that's kind of what it's facing. And that's all I really need to do. As long as the bottom of it is not in the ground, because that'll enable it to fall through. That's how the terrain collider works. As long as it's above the ground and facing in a good way, I can go ahead and just run my scene. It will automatically take precedence over the camera that's already in there. So you'll see if I hit play, all of a sudden, I'm in my world, and I can use WASD and the mouse to move around. You might see the little message at the bottom that there are 2 audio listeners in the scene. You definitely can't have 2 audio listeners, but since the first-person controller had an audio listener on it and I didn't turn the other one off, you see that message. But now I can just look around and move and explore the different parts that I've built. Here's an area over here with some good dirt. I can see that these edges are pretty rough right here, so that I can make a note that this is obviously something I want to smooth out. I can move over here, see somewhere my cliff is. I can see the stretching on the textures here, and see that maybe I'd want to fix that. So this gives you an option to just kind of be in the game and experience it in that way. One more thing is I can, with the character controller over here, I can come over here to my inspector and click movement. And max forward movement is 6. Let's make that like 20, which is going to make exploring our world much faster, right? So I can definitely see more stuff more quickly. And you can see the pathing I have on the ground and everything. So some different things there. So basically, yeah, the first-person character controller allows me to actually get into the game to see, you know, how big it is. Because this might not look like a very big piece of terrain until you run it and you realize, oh, it's actually a fairly adequately large piece of terrain. All right, and there's a lot of stuff that could be in here. So we have a lot of options there. Okay, so that's kind of going to wrap up what I wanted to talk about today. So let's talk a little bit about what we've talked about, right? So we've talked about what terrain is, okay, and you can see now that what terrain is. It's this whole, you know, natural thing, non-man-made stuff that you get to walk around on. All right, we talked about height maps and what a height map is and how it's a scale between 0 and 255, black to white. I do apologize for the one height map not working. I'm not entirely certain what I did to screw that up, but, you know, what are you going to do, right? That just happens. We talked about how you sculpt your terrain using the paint height, the raise and lower terrain, and the smooth terrain tools. We talked about how we can export our own height maps. We talked about texturing our terrain, and we talked about the first-person controller. So again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and following along. Hopefully you learned something about terrain today. I will bring this back up. If you have any questions or comments, or you just want to talk with us or hang out, you can find us on Twitter at Unity3D, at Mike Geig, which is me, at Will Goldstone, and at The Ant Ranch. Feel free to pass along any questions, comments, really any suggestions, any topics that you want. You know, just hit us up on Twitter. We're all Twitter fiends, I'm sure. So feel free to hit us up and talk there. Thank you all very much. I'm really sorry for the rough start. Thank you for sticking around. We will smooth out some of these bugs, and we will come back on the next scheduled event. I think there's one for next week scheduled right now, but feel free to check it out. We will come back with this stuff figured out. So thank you very much, and have a great day.